My name is Kleczka, and I'm a climate justice activist, social scientist, and writer. My area of expertise is climate psychology and how we can use the social sciences to facilitate systemic change in order to fight the climate crisis. I currently work in climate policy for an environmental think tank, and I'm also a freelance researcher, journalist, writer, mainly in the area of fossil fuel phase out, some out for ditching fossil fuels and prioritizing a just transition here in the UK and around the world.
Great. So you're in the UK at the moment. Are you still in Wales?
Yeah, I'm based in Aberystwyth most of the time. So I split my time between Wales and London because that's where my day job is based. And I'm very lucky to have flexible working conditions. I usually spend about 5 to 7 days a month in London. I'm from Poland originally. I grew up in a small coal town, which is quite ironic, and grew up in Germany for most of my childhood, and then moved to the UK when I was 19 and have been here since.
Great. So could you tell me a little bit more about your journey? Because I know you started out with studying climate psychology, but I think I've seen you say that you sort of decided to move more towards policy than psychology. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. So I didn't study climate psychology per se. I actually started off wanting to go into forensic psychology, and I studied psychology and criminology, and then realized when I realized the extent of the climate crisis, I had always been aware of environmental issues because, as I said, my family is from a coal town and I grew up in a very industrialized, very polluted area in Germany. But when I realized the full extent and the meaning of the climate crisis for our society, ecosystems, etc., I decided that I wanted to dedicate my time to that. And that led to a lot of self-exploration and also explore the academic system and how much scope there is for bringing psychology into the environmental sector and environmental and climate research, especially in the area of systems change. So I then decided to drop criminology, and my university at that time, which was City University in London, they were very accommodating, and they gave me that flexibility to continue doing a regular psychology degree in my last year and to focus my research on climate and mental health, which I then did. And I wrote my dissertation on ecological grief in the context of systemic change and the role of communities, and also the role of media, etc., media framing. So that was quite interesting. And then this really led to a bit of an identity crisis because I see myself as a social scientist and as a psychologist, but I didn't see myself in therapy or as a therapist or in the NHS. So I tried out a few different things. I worked with a number of grassroots groups, did a couple independent research projects after my dissertation. And then I found this master's degree in Aberystwyth, which is climate change impact and adaptation. And it's very unique in that it combines climate and environmental sciences and the social sciences. And they again gave me the flexibility to focus on the social sciences and psychology. And I then wrote my thesis on values-based approaches to systemic change, which we can talk about a little bit more later because it's quite an interesting topic, and visited intentional communities within that research project. And while I was doing that, I realized I'd quite like to go into policy because my master's degree showed me that policy, especially environmental policy, is often made without taking into account human psychology. And policymakers can often forget that you can have the best science in the world, you can have the best policies in the world, but if they're not suited to how our brains work, it's not going to work. And unfortunately, we've seen a few environmental policies which sound great on paper, but they simply don't work because they don't correspond to how we work as human beings. And I found that very frustrating in my master's degree. Now, I wrote quite a few policy analysis and a few critiques on how various government departments work and why they don't work in this respect. And yeah, then ended up applying for a job in climate policy, which I ended up getting with Green Alliance. And yeah, I've been really enjoying my work there. I think I'm the only or one of the very few social scientists on the team. And some of the work I do is, for example, we're working on a project now on transforming the tax system. For example, our current VAT system disincentivizes pro-environmental behavior. For instance, we see that we have 20% VAT on retrofitting homes and 0 VAT on building new homes. So there is an incentive there to demolish homes and build new homes rather than retrofitting existing homes, which obviously is not very good for the environment and not very logical. So looking at these kind of things and how we can change them in order to make sustainable practices more commonplace and lower the barriers to that. And I'm especially looking at psychological barriers and political barriers in the way of making those changes. How can we communicate those changes in order to implement them? And how can we make it easier for the public to adopt those changes? And one thing I personally find very important is to shift the focus away from individual behavior change, which has been which started as the zero waste movement, you know, and becoming more sustainable and that kind of eco movement, which is very important. And there's definitely a place for that. Consumer choice can be very powerful. But also that has been co-opted by government to a certain extent, to the point where a lot of the focus now is on the consumer, and the consumer will have to make more sustainable decisions, although we all navigate in a system that makes it very, very hard to live sustainably. So one thing I'm very passionate about is how can we change the system and shift the frameworks so that within those frameworks, sustainability is the default choice. So that's kind of my main interest I'm working on at the moment.
Great, thank you. And it sounds so obvious, but you know, so tragic in a way that it's overlooked. Like, how do humans work? How do human brains work? How do we work in groups? But I come from a psychology background as well. Maybe we just see everything through that lens, and it's surprising when other people don't, right? So yeah, maybe you could tell me a little bit more about the research then from your master's, because you mentioned that that is really interesting and something you'd like to share a bit more.
Yeah, definitely. So in my master's degree, I did some very interesting research, which I haven't fully concluded yet. But what I basically did, my premise was that a lot of our behavior and the factors that influence whether we act in a pro-environmental way or not are very largely dependent on our values. And our values determine what kind of things we pursue in life, what we care about, what we spend our time on. So values can be things such as, we call them postmodern values, such as universalism. Universalism means care for the wider society, for the environment, nature. So things that go beyond yourself as an individual, you know. And then there's also openness to change, benevolence, which means caring for people around you. But then there's also values such as conservatism, not wanting things to change, not being very open to change. And power is also a value. Power both in a material dimension, wanting to own a lot of things, wanting to own a lot of money, and power over others. So one thing to always keep in mind is that all humans strive for integrity. We all want to act according to our values, and we all seek that integrity. It's it's a very essential driver of human behavior. And it's important to be aware that for for someone who holds conservative values or who holds the value of power, things like not providing free school meals or slashing universal credit, those things can be consistent with their values, and that will not lead to a conflict in their values. So bringing things back to the climate crisis, what we really need to do is shift our cultural values in a direction that facilitates pro-environmental behavior. And the one value which has often been associated with pro-environmental behavior is universalism, which we also call a self-transcendent value, because you transcend yourself as an individual being, so it's more outward looking and beyond ego and selfish values, and more towards wanting society to be intact and healthy, both society and the natural environment, which can often be seen as the same system. We're talking about eco-psychology from an eco-psychology lens. So yeah, it was a very I was exploring the topic a bit, and because there's not a lot of research on it, there's quite a few studies saying that we have values in order to facilitate pro-environmental behavior and systemic change in that direction, but there haven't been very many specific studies. So what I did was I thought to myself, where can I meet people who have made those changes and who have fundamentally changed the way they live on a larger scale than on a household to household basis? And then I thought I might look in intentional communities, because they are based on the very principle of living in harmony with the surrounding natural world. So I visited communities, Brazes in near Reading, Findhorn in the north of Scotland, and Brithdimaw in South Wales. And I spent a week at each community, and I applied principles of Indigenous research and decolonial research, which means that rather than visiting the communities and extracting the information I want, in the narrow time window I had, I attempted to become part of the community. So that meant going to community meetings if the community members were comfortable with me being there, volunteering in the community, coming to community meals, and generally just spending time with the community members in a non-work context, socializing with community members, etc. And what that allowed me to do is it made my data a lot more rich and a lot more genuine. Because if you do these things via Zoom, of course, you're going to learn something about the community, but you're not really going to learn what makes those people tick. And I was very lucky in that at the time I was doing my data collection, COVID cases were quite low, and that allowed me to actually travel to the communities in a safe way and participate in the communities. So I did questionnaires with the communities and interviews on, I analyzed people's values. I gave all of them a value questionnaire, and lo and behold, universalism was very strong in almost every person, and definitely in every community, although there was some variation between communities. So for example, Findhorn had a slightly different makeup of values compared to Brithdimaw or Brazes, for example, which was to be expected, because they're quite different communities in their aims and the way they work. Yeah, so that was really interesting. And my aim in this approach and research question is to find out or reinforce our knowledge of which values are crucial to systemic change towards pro-environmental behavior. And a very interesting study that came out a few years ago showed that our values are actually very flexible. So people often think that the values are quite stable. So I'm Jessica, my values are very universal and pro-environmental, etc. But if life led me to a place where I was surrounded by very conservative people, for example, and people who don't care about the environment, there is a very high chance that that would influence my values. Not necessarily, but there is a very high chance that my values will be influenced to some extent. So our values don't really depend on who we are or our upbringing, although that plays a role as well. And recent research has also shown that our genes also play a role in our values. But to a large extent, our values are shaped by our environment, by our current environment. So that's the people we spend time with, that's our job, that's where we live, and that's the media we consume. And I really want to stress the role of media here, because we consume so much media, some of us 4 or 5 hours a day. I personally, there's many days where I stare at a screen for 8 hours a day, and which automatically comes with a very high degree of media consumption. And that can be involuntary as well, media everywhere. And it has a very considerable impact on the way we perceive information, process information, and how we form our opinions and views on certain issues. So I'm looking at which values we should reinforce in order to facilitate systemic change towards a pro-environmental and sustainable society, and the potential of using media in order to do that. So almost taking the principles of gender from Edward Bernays and people who which had a very devastating impact on society, really, but using those principles, which are psychologically very effective, and using them to facilitate a shift towards a different set of values. And this shift is happening organically. We already see a shift from conservative values to postmodern values, such as universalism. But the question is, how can we speed up this process? Because obviously the climate crisis is is coming to a point where climate action is very, very urgent. You know, our current set of policies puts on a trajectory to, I believe it's 2.7 degrees of warming under our current policies, and 2.4 if we stick to all our NDCs, etc. So we really need to speed up this process. And I'm hoping to use psychology to facilitate the speeding up.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you have very similar thoughts to what I have, which is, you know, from the eco-psychology lens, as you mentioned, I approach it maybe with more flowery spiritual language rather than academic, but still, how do we bring people back into connection, into connectedness with the earth and with each other? And you know what strikes me as you're speaking is thinking, yeah, definitely this is what we need to do, but we're up against these massive interests, right? Like I saw in the Guardian the other day, the history of how fossil fuel companies have paid for articles in media over the years to shift people's views and values. So let's say that these people already know about the psychology of shifting people's values, and so we're sort of, am I right in saying we're sort of up against a lot in terms of trying to shift people's values?
Yeah, absolutely. And following up on what you just said, I believe it's very important that we don't just tackle this problem from academia. One thing I'm very interested in, and I'm actually thinking about making this the topic of my PhD research in a few years, is how can we facilitate more coherent communication between the grassroots level, the policy sector, business, and government. Personally, I believe that the grassroots is the most crucial aspect in driving forward societal and systemic change. Although the policy sector is, of course, very important as well, because you need experts to do the research, to explain to government how to structure their policies, etc., and formulate these frameworks. And you need experts in economics, in the social sciences, in climate science, in transport, and all those different things, which the grassroots often doesn't have capacity for. But we have to remember that without grassroots groups, the UK wouldn't have declared a climate emergency in 2019. That came from pressure from grassroots groups. So the way I see it is that grassroots groups open that window of opportunity. They nudge society in the right direction and open that Overton window, I believe it's called, of making radical change more palatable and bringing it in the field of possibility. And from there, policymakers can make those radical changes in a way that will facilitate bringing in new legislation and new policies and making that work in the system we currently navigate in. And then obviously it's down to government to make those, to put those changes into law, and to businesses to execute those changes in the way they do business. Now, I'm an advocate for degrowth. I believe that we need local economies and that we need to very drastically reduce our consumption. But the fact is that the system we're currently in, that capitalist neoliberal system, it's not going to go away overnight. So it's really important, while we push for more system, for a radically different system and a healthier system, we still have to navigate within the system we're currently in and try and transform that system both from within and from outside, with the grassroots putting on the outside pressure, and policymakers and potentially businesses, some businesses, putting on the pressure from inside. And that can be the role of progressive politicians as well. So I'm very interested in how can we facilitate communication between the grassroots policy and all those different areas of change, and how can we structure the work of those different sectors to, again, speed up the transition and speed up systemic change. And that's a very fascinating area. I've been in very many discussions around, is the grassroots more effective, or is the NGO sector more effective, or do we all need to go into politics? I personally believe that it starts with the grassroots, but we need all those areas to be agents of change.
And do you feel that something is shifting? Because I don't know if it's just my optimism or not, but when I came to the UK most recently and turned on the TV, I felt that we were suddenly talking about climate change and the climate crisis, and that there seemed to be some shift taking place that I hadn't noticed because I'd been away for so long.
I believe that things are definitely shifting, but they're not shifting quickly enough. We see some really positive changes. We see, I just saw some statistics today showing that now in November, climate change was voted as an important issue by the UK public. So that's really good to see, and obviously that's going to have a political influence. And we see that younger generations, my generations, and people and younger people are very, very concerned about climate change. But we see almost this cross-generational culture war of people who don't want to change, of people who are not willing to tackle this problem in a way, in an adequate way. And the younger generations who care so much and are in large numbers driven into despair by the inaction of those in power, who tend to be the older generations. You're probably aware of the recent research from the University of Bath showing that what was it, 78% of young people across the world are depressed because of climate change, and many of them feel hopeless and that it's already too late, and they feel like they've been betrayed by government, which of course comes with very, very difficult political implications, because if you have a generation of young people who feel hopeless, and as a result will not engage with politics, that has very, very scary implications for our democracy, really. And that's why I think it's so important to empower the youth and bring young people into those spaces, bring young people into politics, and raise them to be these agents of change. And I think it's really scary that more and more young people disengage with politics. Obviously, it's very tempting to be in your little bubble of not wanting to engage with the system, or being in your grassroots environmental bubble. And I've been there. It's very comfortable. It's very comfortable to be only surrounded by people who care about the climate crisis, and it makes you feel like things are moving really swiftly when in fact they're not. So I believe engaging young people with politics in order to increase political pressure on the dominating system will be really crucial in driving that change forward. And yeah, just come back to your point, yeah, it's happening, but it's not happening quickly enough. And we need to mobilize young people, both on the grassroots and political level, in order to make that change happen.
And you mentioned that your bachelor's research was climate grief, right? And so what I was thinking now is, yeah, maybe it looks like progress when more people are aware of the climate crisis, but if their awareness just leads them into depression and inaction. And what I've noticed a lot is people who 5 years ago didn't believe in climate change have now swung to, oh yeah, well, it's too late to do anything. So, you know, whatever the narrative, it still excuses their inaction, right? So yeah, bringing in that research and what you know about these, you know, climate related emotions, let's say, yeah, for all of these depressed young people, how can they start to shift out of that feeling of hopelessness and actually realize that they can be part of making a difference?
That's a very important question, and I think there's many different dimensions to that. So my bachelor's research, unfortunately, I didn't get any young people to participate in my interviews. I think the age range was, I think, between 28 and 65. So it was more focused on adult environmentalists. And I was looking at is, does ecological grief follow the same stages as grief for a loved one? And it does, which other researchers have established before me, and I confirmed with my research. Some interesting findings I had in my study was the impact of media framings. So media framings in many of my participants triggered feelings of despair, shock, and grief, and in many people led to paralysis and inability to act. And that feeling can persist for a few days, a few weeks, or years. And I believe that it's really important to find a healthy balance between conveying the urgency of the climate emergency, but not falling into the doomist narrative. And I'm doing a lot of work on this at the moment. And basically, to put it short, it all comes down to binary thinking, which is very ingrained into our Western societies. We use binary thinking to, it's basically a cognitive strategy to make it easier to process information. So we have binaries for gender, for example. Many people think that the only genders are male and female. In religion and Western storytelling, we often see binaries of good versus evil. In environmentalism, we often see of individual, which I myself fall into very often, because it's so much easier to communicate from that basis. But it's important to recognize that a system is made of individuals, and all individuals navigate within a system. So dismantling those binaries will be really important to build our communication in a way that is more effective, and that doesn't cause those framings of doomism. the interesting about doomism is, and you mentioned earlier how fossil fuel companies paid for climate denialist news, and also paid governments to produce research to show that climate change isn't happening or it's not happening to the degree that scientists say, etc. There's a really interesting book on that called Merchants of Doubt, which covers the topic really well. What we see now are so-called discourses of delay from the fossil fuel industry. And there's several different ones, one of them being, there's still the narrative that climate change is not as bad as we thought. There's the narrative that fossil fuel companies are progressive and they're doing the right thing and they're so green, greenwashing, many people will be familiar with that. One of those strategies is woke washing, so using social justice arguments to kind of push their agenda and saying fossil fuel phase out will affect marginalized communities, and completely ignoring the fact that those companies are to a large degree responsible for environmental racism and pollution in poor communities. And one discourse of delay, which is not used very publicly by fossil fuel companies, but one we see fossil fuel companies engage in, and I wouldn't be surprised if they funded some of these media framings, is doomism, and basically arguing that it's too late to change and we now have to adapt to the reality of climate change rather than focusing on mitigation. And that is very dangerous. Of course, we have to adapt to the reality of climate change and the impacts we will already see. But at the same time, we have to mitigate any further escalation of climate change. And the doomist narrative is very dangerous in that it reinforces environmental racism. Obviously, for us in Western countries, it's a lot easier to just adapt to climate change, build walls to reduce flooding and adjust what kind of food we grow and where we grow it and all those kind of things. They're a lot easier in rich countries that will be less affected by climate change, like the UK. But if we look at countries in the global south, especially those which are already very hugely affected by climate change, India, Bangladesh, countries in Africa which really struggle with drought, you can't really tell them to just adapt to climate change, can you? Because those places are going to become uninhabitable if we don't tackle climate change. So in my view, climate doomism reinforces the systems of colonialism and environmental racism. And it's very important to recognize, it's very important to honor those feelings of despair and grief. It's very important that we recognize them, but it's also important to be aware that adapting to climate change and engaging in those doomist narratives comes from a place of privilege. And a lot of people don't have the privilege to just say, oh, it's too late anyway, let's just adapt to it and make the best of it. For many people, climate change is a matter of life and death. And I believe that doomist narratives really don't help those countries at all. We need very urgent action to contain climate change as much as possible and safeguard those who are already most affected by it. So yeah, it's a very difficult balance to strike between expressing urgency and reinforcing those doomist narratives. And I'm doing a bit of work on that, how we can communicate effectively, how we can mobilize people by using urgent language, but not paralyze them by being too urgent.
It's a hard balance to strike, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
And it strikes me as well that when we're in fight or flight mode, we fall into binary thinking, right? Because you don't have time to think about the nuance. So yeah, I've been interested recently in the body and the nervous system, and how do we not kick the sympathetic nervous system into overdrive with the narrative, because then people just panic and they can't appreciate maybe the shades of gray in the middle. So yeah, so I will just wrap up now because I'm looking at the time, and I want to thank you so much for sharing what you have. And just to ask you, is there anything else that you would really like to share or to say?
Ooh, we talked about so many interesting things. Just to come back to your point of climate change and despair manifesting in the body, I believe that's so important. I did some work myself on that, the flight or fight mode, which you just noticed, and it's so important to remember. And that's going back to binaries again. We often see ourselves as a binary as well, a binary of the mind and the body, when in reality those are the same system. The mind and the body are so connected, and falling into those narratives of doomism and despair affect us on a very physical level. Going back to the model of fight, flight, or freeze, those are the three most common stress reactions. We see those in as a response to climate doomism, and they reinforce climate denial, which is very problematic, with the fight response being engaging in not extreme, but engaging in activism to a very extreme extent and dedicating your whole life to activism. I've personally been there, and I burnt out, and it wasn't very healthy. The flight response being running away from the problem, not engaging with it, or even engaging in climate denial. And the freeze response being that what we call eco paralysis, this inability to act because you're so afraid. So yeah, very important to remember that climate change is something very physical, both in the way climate change will impact us through extreme weather events, but also the fear of climate change and the mental health effects of climate change. They will affect us on a very physical level. And going back to psychology and mental health, it's very important that those effects of climate change are taken into account in our healthcare services and our mental health care services. Climate grief and climate anxiety will become more prevalent. And again, it's important to recognize them even in countries that are not directly affected by climate change. And it's important to help people on that healing journey, because we need our agents of change to be healthy, functioning human beings. And we need to prioritize our well-being as activists and as agents of change in order to drive forward change.
Absolutely. That's where I plug my stuff as well about emotional intelligence and climate crisis, because yeah, we've got to be aware of how it's manifesting for us, right, in our minds, bodies. As you said, it's the same thing. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Welcome.